Week 7 of the NFL season is in the books, and that means we are headed straight into Week 8 of the NFL season and the fantasy football season. So you know what we need to do. We need to go through every single matchup, every single running back, and break down what players you should be starting and what players you should be sitting as we approach the week. Before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 8 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 8's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH will also receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Let's start with Thursday Night Football. We have the Vikings traveling to face the Rams, and this is a good matchup for Aaron Jones, who is dealing with a hamstring injury, was a little bit banged up in Week 5. And the Vikings had a bye week in Week 6 and is technically on the injury report at the time of recording this, but I'm not going to be too worried about it. But monitor this as the week goes on because it is a short week here for the Vikings. Nonetheless, 20.6 fantasy points in Week 7 for Jones, 93 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 23 receiving yards, good competitive game script against the Lions, and we're going to continue to roll with Aaron Jones as long as he's healthy. Ty Chandler is just a handcuff, nothing else. Not startable unless Aaron Jones is out in Week 8, but this is a great stretch coming up for the Vikings running backs, or I guess just Aaron Jones. The Rams this week, then the Colts, then the Jaguars, then the Titans, then the Bears, then the Cardinals, then the Bears again, then the Seattle Seahawks, then the Packers. This is going to be a great rest of the season for Aaron Jones. If you own him, just keep starting him as long as he is healthy. And another player that we are going to continue starting no matter what, as long as he's healthy, is Kyren Williams. Tougher matchup against the Vikings this week. This is a good run defense, but you got to start Kyren Williams. He is the RB4 in fantasy football. He has 14.4 or more fantasy points in every start in the season, 19.6 fantasy points in Week 7, 76 yards on the ground, and 2 touchdowns. I know Kupp is coming back. Not worried about it. Maybe it limits some of Kyren Williams' touchdown upside, but ultimately, this is the heartbeat of the Rams offense, whatever they have left of an offense, and Kyren Williams is a weekly starter on a week in, week out basis. Outside of that, Blake Corum, Ronnie Rivers, these are just handcuffs. These are not players that we're going to in any way be considering unless we see a major injury to Kyren Williams. But into Sunday, we have the Packers traveling to face the Jaguars, and Josh Jacobs, 20 fantasy points in Week 7. Had a receiving touchdown off of 5 targets and 5 receptions, and he added 76 yards on the ground for 20.2 fantasy points, his best fantasy mark of the season. And now he gets a matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, allowing the 24th most fantasy points to the running back position. So Jacobs, a very strong start this week. If you own him, just keep rolling with them. I know some of you guys still disappointed in Jacobs, but he's a top 15 running back on the season. He has double-digit fantasy points in every game on the year except for Week 3 against the Titans. If you own him, keep starting Josh Jacobs. Now, what do we do with the Jaguars running backs? We have a running back by committee situation. It's a tough matchup as the Packers are giving up the 14th fewest fantasy points to the running back position, but it could be worse. My thesis with Bigsby going into Week 7 was you start him with confidence if ETN does not play. If ETN does play, then Bigsby is down in that flex area. But now we've got ETN still on the injury report dealing with the hamstring injury. And then we get a little sprinkle of Dearness Johnson as well, who had 10 fantasy points in Week 7, getting some involvement in the passing game. So I'm just going to say if you own Bigsby, he's startable no matter what. He's a better start if ETN does not play. If ETN does play, then once again, he gets moved down to like that kind of fringe RB2 area. But for the most part, Bigsby is the running back that I want to start for the Jaguars. ETN's a low, you got nothing better, RB2 fringe area play. I don't even know what I'm saying really. I don't have a ton of confidence in ETN, but he is startable if he does play. Should be at least a good game script where the Jaguars need to stay in the football game, but I guess also that could hurt them if they're down due to this defense and the Packers are tossing up points against them. But ETN gets involved in the passing game, so if he's healthy, he's okay. Dearness Johnson gets involved in the passing game. So I'm going to put it this way to finalize things. I'm probably staying away from the Jaguars running backs if ETN is healthy this week. If he's not, then I'll start Bigsby. Bigsby is really the only running back that I'm looking to start this week. But man, what a confusing, awful backfield we have here for the Jaguars as we approach week 8. Next up, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Dolphins. As a reminder, I have to record these early on Mondays, so Monday Night Football has not been played yet. Don't know how James Conner has looked against the Chargers, but I'm a little worried about him in that matchup. We'll see. Nonetheless, this is a great matchup for both sides in terms of the running back position. The Dolphins giving up the 31st most fantasy points to the running back position. Connor should be a solid start this week. Maybe if this offense struggles in week 7, you don't have a lot of confidence, they should be able to bounce back against the Dolphins this week. I'm not too worried about Connor. If there's any major injuries or anything that sways my opinion, it'll be in a pinned comment down below. Trey Benson, Amari DeMarcado, DJ Dallas. I mean, just not enough here. These are all players that we are in no way going to consider unless there's a major injury to James Conner. Now, Devon Achane came back to action in week 7 after having the concussion that took him out of the game early in week 5, then a bye week in week 6, 10.5 fantasy points, 77 yards on the ground, and added 2 receptions for 8 receiving yards. So I do like Devon Achane this week. It's a great matchup against the Cardinals. They have struggled against the running back position, giving the 25th most fantasy points to the position. So I like Devon Achane this week. Solid start. Tua's coming back. That should help. Raheem Mostert, 3 fantasy points in week 7. Then Jalen Wright, 3.3 fantasy points in week 7. So it's Devon Achane's backfield. Mostert, Wright, startable if something happens to Achane. But until then, we're rolling with Devon Achane, and things should look better. Cross our fingers with Tua at quarterback here in week 8. Next up, we have the Jets traveling to face the Patriots. And Breece Hall, just a starter every week. Does not matter. In weeks 4 and 5, told you guys, go out and trade for Breece Hall. Do it. 2 tough matchups against Denver and Minnesota, 2 of the best run defenses in the league. He had a little down stretch in the past 2 weeks. 21.9 fantasy points against the Bills, 26.1 fantasy points against the Steelers. He had a touchdown, 38 yards on the ground, but more importantly, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 103 receiving yards. Great outing for Breece Hall in week 7 against a good Steelers run defense. But the addition of Devontae Adams is opening up the middle of the field for Breece Hall. We'll take advantage of that from a fantasy perspective as long as we can. It is a good matchup against the Patriots this week. You own Breece Hall. There's no reason to sit him. Braylon Allen is just a handcuff. I've been saying it for weeks. He's nothing but a handcuff. Week 2 was kind of an anomaly against the Titans. Week 3, garbage time points against the Patriots. Outside of that, 5.6 or less fantasy points every single game on the season. He's a good handcuff. Don't get me wrong. He's a talented player. I did have the touchdown called back 2 weeks ago against the Bills, but he's a handcuff. We don't want to start him. Now, Ramondre Stevenson, Antonio Gibson. What do we do here? Well, this Jets run defense, they just look like they cannot stop the run. So they still rank like top 15 against the running back position, but every single week, it's like, really? I don't know about that. Stevenson was a disappointment, to say the least, against the Jags in week 7, though. 7 touches for 18 rushing yards, 3 targets, 2 receptions for 7 receiving yards, and 4.5 fantasy points. Like, this was a smash spot for Stevenson. He should have been a great play. And then Antonio Gibson, just no fantasy relevancy, as he had 2.3 fantasy points in week 7. So, Stevenson's in that kind of fringe RB2 area. If you have to start him, sure. If you have other options that you feel more confident in, probably go with the other options. But Stevenson is still startable this week at home. But I don't know. Maybe we need to get a bigger picture on what this offense looks like with Drake May at quarterback. I don't have a ton of confidence in Stevenson this week, but he's still an okay start here in week 8. Next up, we have the Ravens traveling to face the Browns. And once again, Monday Night Football has not been played at the time of recording this, but I'm expecting a good game out of Derrick Henry. And if there's any major injuries or anything that for some reason changes my mind on Derrick Henry, it'll be in a pinned comment down below. Justice Hill is probably going to be a sit for me. I mean, this Browns defense certainly doesn't scare me, but they are top 12 against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So he's always a guy you can throw in there and cross your fingers, but he only has double-digit fantasy points in 2 games this year, and in both those games, he had at least 6 receptions. So, I mean, yeah, sure, Hill can always potentially get you points, but I don't know if I want you guys to risk that unless you are very, very, very desperate. Okay. Last week, I told you guys if you want to start Nick Chubb, I think he is perfectly fine to start. And I got, like, some of you guys were upset about that. And I'm like, well, Jerome Ford is hurt. And I don't think Nick Chubb is going to be in this mix unless they're going to utilize Nick Chubb, and they did. 11 touches, 22 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 3 targets, 1 reception. Now, Donta Foreman had 2 touches on the ground, and then we saw a little sprinkle of Pierre Strong as well, who had 3 touches and 3 targets. But obviously going to be a different look for this offense this week with some combination of DTR and or Jameis Winston at quarterback with Watson out for the year. But the reason why Chubb gets downgraded this week is because of the quarterback change. Not that Watson was doing the Browns offense any favor, but now we don't exactly know what to expect. Could be good, could be bad. But also this is a tough matchup. The Ravens have been very good against the running back position, top 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. So it's a tough matchup. This offense kind of in shambles. Nick Chubb is still startable, but I'm not going to go out of my way necessarily to start him this week. And then in week 9, they get the Chargers before a bye week in week 10. So I don't know how much upside Chubb is going to have the next week or two, but he's at least startable here in week 8. Next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Bengals, and Saquon Barkley, you start him no matter what. Told you guys, if there's a buy low window after week 6 going into week 7 on Barkley, do it. Buy him. Trade whatever you can coming off of that 7.4 fantasy day in week 6 because Barkley is going to continue to be a stud for the rest of the season. And I also told you guys I loved Barkley going up against his former team last week. He was one of our underdog picks last week. 176 rushing yards, a touchdown, 2 catches for 11 receiving yards, 26.7 fantasy points. He's about to go on a tear the next couple of weeks. The Bengals, the Jaguars, the Cowboys, the Commanders, the Rams. The next 5 weeks, Barkley is going to be on an absolute tear. He gets Carolina in week 14. This is a player that we're starting no matter what. I mean, he's the RB2 in fantasy football. We don't really need to break it down. But Kenneth Gainwell did see a fair amount of touches last week, 13 touches and a reception. But he's still just a handcuff here. And I mean, Will Shipley had 8 touches. They were just running the football all over the Giants. But Shipley, Gainwell have not had any fantasy relevancy so far on the year. So we're going to continue to sit those two and view them as handcuffs to Barkley. Now, Chase Brown, kind of a down week in week 7 against the Browns. 7.3 fantasy points, 44 rushing yards, 2 targets, 2 receptions. Compare that to Zach Moss, who had 6 touches, 7 rushing yards, 1.17 yards per carry, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 7 fantasy points. So, I mean, both these players are certainly startable. The Eagles have been pretty good against the run, 13th fewest fantasy points to the position. So, like, you could start either guy here. I think Zach Moss is more of like a low-end RB2 that I don't really want to start. He hasn't looked as good in the past couple weeks. He's had the injury. Chase Brown has looked much better, but then Brown kind of came back to life this past week against the Browns. But I'm going to keep the confidence in Chase Brown. He passes the eye test. I think it's going to be a nice competitive matchup between the Eagles and the Bengals. So I'll start Chase Brown this week. I'm a little bit more worried about Zach Moss as we enter week 8. Next up, we have the Colts traveling to face the Texans, and this is a tough matchup for these Colts running backs as the Texans rank top 10 against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed. The Colts are hopeful that Jonathan Taylor will return to practice this week, so there's a chance that JT will suit up in week 8. There's a chance that he could have played in week 7. We'll find out. It's a tough matchup. They get another tough matchup next week against the Vikings. Anthony Richardson not playing super inspired. Colts are 4-3 and just one game behind the Texans right now. So this is a big matchup. I mean, we'll see what happens. But yeah, if JT plays, you can still start Jonathan Taylor. If he's healthy, he's good to go. This is a player we want to start. I think if he's out, Tyler Goodson is kind of in that fringe RB2 area. Like, you can start him if you need to. You're desperate. He's just 15% rostered. I prefer him at this point over Trey Sermon, but still, I'm going to prefer to stay away from these Colts running backs that aren't Jonathan Taylor. But Goodson does have double-digit fantasy points in his last two matchups and at least had 8.7 points against the Jags. Sermon had the good game against the Jaguars with 18.3 fantasy points and has now had 5.9 or less fantasy points in his last two matchups. So, yeah, I just don't want to start Trey Sermon, and I don't really prefer to start Goodson, but he's at least an option if JT does not play. Joe Mixon, since returning from that injury he suffered in Week 2 on Sunday Night Football against the Bears, has just been tearing it up. 27.2 fantasy points in Week 6, 26.4 in Week 7, 115 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 3 targets, 2 receptions. You own Joe Mixon. Don't even think about it. He is in the must-start category. And I just can't ignore Joe Mixon's line right now on Underdog. His rushing line sits at 69.5 total rushing yards. He has smashed that in the last 2 weeks, and he's smashed that in Week 1 as well. Going up against this Colts defense that does not scare me in any way whatsoever, I would head straight to Underdog, hit the higher on Joe Mixon's rushing yards, and don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to receive a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 8. Take your free Pick'em, take the over on Mixon's total rushing yards, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing that, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Dameon Pierce, 0.2 fantasy points in Week 7. Solid handcuff. Had a big outing in Week 6, but that was the Patriots, not the Packers, and this is the Colts. I mean, Pierce is a handcuff. We're not going to trust him on a weekly basis, but I guess there's always potential for something. Dare Gunbowale has been completely X'd out of the game plan with Joe Mixon back. He, had a couple matchups there where he was getting some nice receiving work, but it just looks like with Mixon healthy, this is their primary running back, and they're not concerned about anyone else getting touches. Start Mixon. Let's hope JT plays this week, and everyone else, for the most part, we're going to stay away from in this matchup. Next up, we have the Titans traveling to face the Lions, and Tony Pollard, just 8.5 fantasy points in Week 7, took a hard hit, looked like he was going to miss maybe this game, and then he was able to play and come back, had 61 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 2 receptions, his second worst fantasy outing so far on the season. Tough matchup against the Lions, top 5 against the position. I've liked Pollard a lot on the season, but we got Mason Rudolph at quarterback who, had 2 turnovers and 3 fumbles. Like, I don't know how much better he is than Will Levis. I don't know what to think about this offense. This could be a big defensive day for the Lions at home. Pollard is really only startable if you absolutely have to. On the other hand, Tajay Spears could play this week, might not play this week, dealing with the hamstring injury. I don't really care. I'm staying away from Tajay Spears this week. He's not going to be a start for me. Then we got Julius Chestnut, also going to be a sit for me. The only Titans running back we can consider in a tough matchup this week is Tony Pollard. Now, David Montgomery had the knee issue in Week 7. Kept him out for part of the game. He came back. He fumbled. The Lions still won. All that stuff. His worst fantasy outing on the year at 8 fantasy points. But, my viewpoint on Monty since Week 1 has been, if you own Monty, start Monty every single week. And believe it or not, early in the season, not everyone agreed with that. People were still saying this is Gibbs' backfield, and Monty's just going to be a sprinkle here and there. And really, this is a 1A, 1B backfield where both running backs are very, very productive. Monty will be okay. They get the Titans this week. Titans come in 10th against the running back position. Don't really care. Home game. Start Monty. Gibbs, 32 fantasy points in Week 7 against a great Vikings run defense, 116 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Like, he didn't just get this done through the air. He had 44 receiving yards, but he averaged 7.73 yards per carry. Gibbs must start every week. He's a top 10 fantasy running back. David Montgomery, a top 10 fantasy running back. Start both these guys on a weekly basis. Next up, we have the Falcons traveling to face the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Bijan Robinson, just to start for me every single week. Don't care who he's facing. Bijan Robinson, another running back in the past couple of weeks that I told you guys, go out, buy low on Bijan. Don't think twice about it. He's going to be great. 23.3 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games, 103 rushing yards in week 7, a touchdown, and 40 receiving yards. Bijan is a top 10 fantasy football running back. You start him every week, and we will leave it at that. I'm expecting a good game script here against the Buccaneers, who come in 16th against the running back position. Tyler Algier, it's one thing to start him against the Panthers. It's another thing to start him against other teams, right? 5.5 fantasy points in week 7 after having 19.8 against the Panthers in week 6. So, I mean, Algier is certainly a good running back, 7.2 yards per carry in week 7, but he's just a handcuff to Bijan that we can really only take a chance on in extremely strong matchups. Now, at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, so this is very similar to the Jaguars situation here, okay? It is a bad matchup in Week 7 against the Ravens, but I mean, I'm expecting points in this game. At the time I'm recording this, Rachaad White is still questionable. You got Sean Tucker in this committee now. It all depends. Like, I would expect, even if Rachaad White's not ready Week 7, that he's ready Week 8. I mean, he had 5.6 fantasy points to Bucky in Week 5 against Atlanta, 9.6 to Rachaad White in Week 5, 0 to Sean Tucker, but that was before the emergence in the game against the Saints with 34.2 fantasy points. So, I mean, I've been kind of saying this since the end of Week 6, like, proceed with a lot of caution with this Tampa Bay Buccaneers running back situation. Like, sure, there's certainly a lot of points that could be had. There's a lot of risk and volatility here as well. We really need a couple more weeks to kind of see how this thing shakes out. So I prefer Bucky Irving right now in this running back committee. But Rachaad White, if and when healthy, will have an impact on the touches overall here and the volume. And we don't really know what to expect out of Sean Tucker. So if my views on this change, and of course, if there's any major injury after Monday Night Football, I will have a pinned comment down below you guys can check out. But for now, I'm kind of proceeding with caution around Tucker and White. And they're not even in a category. There's a question mark to me. I don't know how you can really have confidence in them. And Monday Night Football is going to be a big indicator of that. And if you guys go back and watch last week's video going into Monday Night Football, this was exactly how the slide looked. Bucky Irving startable. The other two, I don't know. So that's still where I'm at as we approach Week 8. We will see what happens. Next up, we have the Saints traveling to face the Chargers, and this might be one of the ugliest games of the week. We got Spencer Rattler at quarterback. We got a great Chargers defense. I still have Kamara in the start category, but really, I mean, his upside is very, very, very capped against the Chargers this week with Rattler at quarterback. This is a Chargers defense that is for real. Top 3 against the running back position. I would proceed with some caution with Alvin Kamara, but I mean, he's one of these players. Just how do you bench him? I mean, 7 targets, 6 receptions, saved his fantasy day somewhat in week 7 with 8.4 fantasy points, but he had 1.43 yards per carry. Like, it's not just Spencer Rattler. Like, it's easy to point the finger, but I mean, Chris Olave is banged up. Rashid Shaheed has hit the IR. This offensive line's not playing great. The defense is really starting to bend after a pretty strong start to the season. So a lot of issues here. Bad matchup against the Chargers this week. Now, Derek Carr might play this week, which I think at that point you can have more confidence. But yeah, Kamara is definitely still startable, but we may want to tamper expectations going into the week. Jamal Williams, just a handcuff. We're not starting Jamal Williams. Okay. J.K. Dobbins, on the other hand, once again, Monday Night Football has not been played at the time of recording this, but I'm expecting a good outing for Dobbins against the Cardinals. They've been a weak run defense so far on the year, and Dobbins has just been really solid throughout the season outside of 2 tough matchups against Pittsburgh and Kansas City. So Dobbins, one of these guys that I absolutely love. I think he's a great start on a weekly basis. The Saints 26 against the running back position. They've just been torched by Javonte Williams and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs in the last 2 weeks. So, yeah, I think Dobbins a very strong start. Now, I've got Kamani Vidal in the fringe kind of category. This really depends on what he does or does not do against the Cardinals. Like, I think after the week 6 touchdown and 13.1 fantasy points, there's some potential upside against the Cardinals, a little sneaky upside. So we'll see what happens. If he has another solid outing, I think he could be a sneaky start. I mean, once again, we saw Sean Tucker and Bucky Irving 2 weeks ago shred this New Orleans Saints defense. And then last week we saw Javonte Williams shred this defense as well. So I think there's some opportunity potentially for Kamani Vidal. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Jaleel McLaughlin, the RB2 for the Broncos, last week had 8.7 yards per carry against the Saints. So his run defense is not good, but we'll kind of see how Monday Night Football goes for Vidal, and maybe he could end up being a potential fringe RB2 option for you guys in week 8. Except we have the Bills traveling to face the Seattle Seahawks, and James Cook, a down week in week 7, 9.2 fantasy points, but I think we still continue to start James Cook. He's a top 15 running back on the season so far. He's been very, very good. And I will say I have Ray Davis in the sit category, but Ray Davis is probably closer to the category at this point in time. I don't quite know if I'm 100% ready to trust Ray Davis. I mean, he had just 5 touches in week 7. Obviously, in week 6, in the absence of James Cook, he had 20 touches, and he's had double digits in the last 2 weeks. He's looked very good, and Ray Davis was a player that we liked going into the season, right? But if the volume was higher in week 7, I think for sure we'd have him bumped up this week. It's a decent matchup against the Seahawks, giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to the position. If you're desperate, I think Ray Davis is an okay start, but I was a little worried about that volume. He's certainly taken over Ty Johnson as the RB2 on this team. So Cook, I think we still roll with. He still scored a touchdown in week 7. The game script, was more of a passing game script against the Titans. Like, he's been fine. Davis is very intriguing, but we'll wait and see what happens. I will say there's a couple good matchups coming up here, including this week: Seattle, Miami, Indianapolis in the next 3 weeks before a tough matchup against Kansas City in week 11. But Davis, let's just wait and see. But I mean, he's getting close to that area where we can start to say he could be a starter. Now, Kenneth Walker is a starter on a week-in, week-out basis. We all know this. He's a top 10 fantasy running back. He's been great. You can rely on him every single week, and the Bills just can't stop the run. They just can't. 29th against the position on the season. Kenneth Walker is a very strong start here in week 8. 23.3 fantasy points in week 7. 69 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 2 targets, 2 receptions for 24 receiving yards and a second touchdown through the air. So yes, start Walker every week. Zach Charbonnet is just a handcuff. He had some standalone value in the first 4 weeks of the season and filled in very nicely in that stretch for Walker when Walker did miss some time. But right now, Charbonnet, just a handcuff here in week 8. Next up, we have the Bears traveling to face the Washington Commanders, and DeAndre Swift is a solid start this week. 20 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts. A week 7 bye week for the Bears. He's a solid start as the Commanders are giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the running back position. I like Swift a lot this week. Roschon Johnson is a sit for me. I mean, this is a player who can always maybe find the end zone, maybe get some value touches, but it's just not startable in fantasy football unless you are extremely desperate in a very deep league and you're just crossing your fingers that he stumbles into the end zone. But I'm not starting Roschon Johnson anytime soon, but a solid handcuff to DeAndre Swift at least. All right, then we look at the Commanders running backs. This is a solid matchup. The Bears giving up the 17th most fantasy points to the running back position. Now, maybe this offense is a little skewed this week if Jaden Daniels misses this game, but it is a home game here for the Commanders, and Brian Robinson Jr. just continues to be a solid start on a weekly basis. One of my favorite running backs in fantasy football. Missed week 6 against the Ravens, and he still is a top 16 running back in fantasy football. 13.1 fantasy points in week 7 against the Panthers. 71 yards on the ground, a touchdown. We kind of expected more out of Brian Robinson Jr., to be honest, against the Panthers' run defense, but he just wasn't really necessary. Marcus Mariota filled in nicely for Jaden Daniels. This offense looked just a little bit different game plan with Mariota coming in. The defense looked great. The Panthers played awful. still a good outing for Robinson. He's a solid start every week. A little bit of a down week for Eckler, but once again, Eckler just wasn't really necessary, just 4 fantasy points. But Eckler, double digits in every other start so far on the year. He's a guy we can always throw in and probably get some points. Then we got Jeremy McNichols, who has been solid when given the opportunity. In any game that he has more than one rushing attempt, he has 4.5 yards per carry or more, and 3 of those 6 or more yards per carry. So I still like Jeremy McNichols, but he's just not a guy that we can start when it comes to fantasy football. Next up is the Chiefs traveling to face the Raiders. And man, Kareem Hunt, this was the one that you wanted off the waiver wire between the plethora of running backs that became available after Isaiah Pacheco's injury. 22.3 fantasy points against the Niners in week 7, 2 touchdowns, 78 yards on the ground, and added 2 receptions. At this point in time, Kareem Hunt is just a start on a weekly basis. Great matchup against the Raiders, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the position. Hunt, a very strong start and even a good flex option if you need to roll him out. I love Kareem Hunt's current rushing yard total on Underdog, sitting at just 65.5 total rushing yards. He has hit that in every single start so far on the season. Now he gets a great matchup against the Raiders. I would head straight to Underdog, hit the higher on Kareem Hunt's total rushing yards. And don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are going to get a free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 8. Take your free Pick'em. Take the over on Hunt's rushing yards. Automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, when you use promo code THECATCH to sign up, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. That link is down below. Samaje Perine, sit, 3.8 fantasy points in week 7. Carson Steele, a sit, 1.7 fantasy points in week 7. Clyde Edwards-Helaire was inactive this past week, but is active on this roster and could potentially be a startable player this week. But yeah, we're not going to risk that, and I don't really know where he stands in terms of this depth chart. So it's Kareem Hunt or nobody else when it comes to this roster. Now, I have talked about Alexander Mattison a lot this season, and I've encouraged you guys to start Alexander Mattison if you needed to in the past couple weeks, and actually quite a bit on the season, leading back to weeks like 2 and 3 even. So I think Mattison gets a little bit of a downgrade this week, though. He's definitely startable, but this Chiefs defense giving up the fewest fantasy points to the running back position so far on the year. I don't know if it's a banged-up Aiden O'Connell at quarterback. I don't know if it's Gardner Minshew at this point in the week yet. I don't know if Jacoby Myers is going to play. Nothing really looks good here for the Raiders offense. And yeah, I'm not messing around when it comes to this Chiefs defense. I encourage you guys last week to be really cautious with starting Jordan Mason, who was a little bit banged up going up against this Chiefs unit. And that ended up being a good thing to recommend, right? Madison's startable, but I don't know what his upside is this week, and I would be a little bit worried if I had to start him. Then we got Zamir White, who had 3.7 fantasy points in his return from missing 2 weeks. Zamir White should not be rostered. He's rostered in 34% of leagues, and that blows my mind. If you own Zamir White, just drop him now, okay? Please, I'm done with Zamir White on the season. I've been done with him. Madison's a running back to own, but it is not a good matchup here in week 8. Up, we will have a matchup between the Panthers and the Broncos. So, Chuba Hubbard, the only bright spot against the Commanders in week 7, I would say, for the Panthers offense, scored a touchdown, 52 yards on the ground, 11.2 fantasy points. Double digits every game this year, except for week 1 for Chuba. He's a solid start, top 12 running back in fantasy football. Now, it's a tough matchup. This Denver Broncos run unit giving up the 18th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. Not too bad, but overall, this is a great defense, and I'm a little worried about this Panthers offense this week, but Chuba is certainly still very startable as we move into the week, and really the only Panthers offensive player that I have any faith in this week. Then we have Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos coming off of his best game of the season with 26.1 fantasy points in week 7, 88 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 3 total receptions. So very good game for Javonte Williams. A long time since Javonte Williams has scored 2 touchdowns in a game. You'd have to go back to his rookie season. This offense for the Broncos not that bad. Bo Nix playing pretty okay right now. And if they're going to have another good game, it's going to be this week against the Panthers at home before they travel to face the Ravens and the Chiefs. If I own Javonte Williams, I am starting him against the worst run defense in the entire league. Javonte, a very strong start this week. If you own him, start him with confidence. This is the Carolina Panthers. They do not stop the run. Their offense is in a bit of shambles. They're on the road. Javonte is in a great spot this week. Jaleel McLaughlin, I know it's a Panthers run defense, but I can't trust him. Audric Estime, I can't trust him either. But this should be a big week for Javonte Williams here in week 8. All right, next up we have the Cowboys traveling to face the Niners. Always a good matchup when these two teams face off each other. And it's a little bit of a tough matchup for Rico Dowdle and the Cowboys running backs here, as the Niners are still top 15 against the running back position, but they also just don't really scare me, and Kareem Hunt just ran all over them. So I like Rico Dowdle, gets involved in the passing game. In week 6, even in the blowout, 10.5 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 30 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns in 2 of his last 3 starts. So I like Dowdle this week. And the Cowboys, they do this. They have 1 or 2 games every year where they get blown out and Dak's awful when they're facing an actual good playoff contending team. So am I surprised, as bad as it was, that the Cowboys lost to the Lions? No. And I'm not going to overreact here. They're still going to have viable fantasy options like Rico and CD and Jake Ferguson, and Dak's not going to just be completely awful for the rest of the season. So Rico Dowdle is definitely startable this week on the road against the Niners, and it's not like the Niners aren't having issues of their own and aren't banged up as well. Ezekiel Elliott is a sit, however. We'll just leave it at that. Zeke has done nothing this year outside of week 1 where he stumbled into the end zone against the Browns, and he is certainly not a start by any stretch. Now, the Cowboys defense has been very bad against the run. They're still giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the position, so I wasn't crazy about Jordan Mason last week. He was like a guy that I was like, if you have to start him, sure, but I don't like that matchup against the Chiefs, and he had 8.9 fantasy points. 58 yards on the ground, his second lowest yards per carry on the season at 4.14, and added 2 receptions. But I do like him this week. I think it's a better situation at home here with the Cowboys coming to town. Much weaker defense than the Chiefs, so Mason definitely startable. And Mason's still the RB10 so far on the season, so I like him this week. Now, there's some light rumors out there that Christian McCaffrey might play this week. He's not going to play this week, I don't think. I don't think he's going to come back till week 10. Now, yeah, I got him on the screen as a start if he plays, but yeah, I don't think he's playing. But the rumors for Christian McCaffrey seem to change every single day. Like when I put this, everything together for this video, there were rumors that he might play this week. And then now it's changed as of 5 hours ago at the time I'm recording this, that he could return in week 10. So who knows what we're going to hear by the time this video has been put out. If Christian McCaffrey plays, yeah, you definitely start Christian McCaffrey, and that changes Jordan Mason's status for the week. But I don't think we're going to see C-Mac till after the bye week. I think that actually makes the most sense. So we'll just go ahead and move on. I don't think he's going to be out there. Now, Isaac Garando, 1 rushing attempt, 1 reception in week 7, 1.7 fantasy points. He's just a handcuff. In week 6, he had some value, but that's because Mason missed some time in that matchup against the Seahawks. So he's a handcuff, and I don't know how much value he's going to be as we approach week 8. Next up, we have the Giants traveling to face the Steelers, and this is just a weird overall matchup for the running back position. Now, it's a bad matchup for all running backs involved. The Steelers giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. The Giants giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. So, if you want to throw out Tyrone Tracy or Devin Singletary as like a fringe RB2, sure, you can do it, but you got to be in a desperate situation to do it. Eric Gray, not startable, but Singletary just 3.1 fantasy points against the Eagles. Tracy, 6.2 fantasy points against the Eagles. Definitely game scripted out. So I think that there's potential that they could perform better against the Steelers, who just gave up a fair amount of fantasy points to Breece Hall, but we really want to compare Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary to Breece Hall? I don't quite think so. So they're startable, but only in desperate situations. Now, Najee Harris going into week 7, wasn't really a guy that I felt a lot of confidence in, but he did find a way to score a touchdown at 16.2 fantasy points and 102 yards on the ground. I thought it'd be a little bit tougher than going up against the Raiders, where he had his first touchdown of the season and 20 fantasy points, but he has been solid the last 2 weeks. He's a top 20 fantasy football running back. I don't really like this matchup for running backs this week, you know. It looks like the Steelers will be throwing the football more with Russell Wilson at quarterback, so Najee's perfectly okay to start. But we'll just kind of have to see if this pattern stays consistent. Now, Jaylen Warren got a little bit more involvement this past week. 12 touches, 44 yards on the ground, 3.67 yards per carry, and 2 receptions, 7.9 fantasy points. So I'm not quite there with Jaylen Warren, but he did look pretty good with the ball in his hands this past week. So continue to monitor him, but he's nothing more than a handcuff. And Najee Harris definitely startable, but I just don't really feel like we're going to get a super high-scoring game between the Giants and the Steelers. We will see. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single running back, every single matchup for Week 8 of the season, and who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 8 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything that you guys need here on the channel to bring home a dub in Week 8. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, players that are going to go nuclear, buy low options, last minute waiver wire additions, all kinds of videos, live fantasy Q&A streams as the week goes on, everything that you guys could possibly need. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.